Poultry anatomy, and you guys are going to have the opportunity to look at some birds and see and witness these differences. But I wanted to talk about this stuff before we opened up these birds so you have an understanding of what's happening. There are major differences and sexually dimorphic differences between male and female chickens or male and female poultry, far more than what we see in some of the other livestock species. So besides, you know, if you look at a boar and a sow next to each other, there are differences, right? You can see testicles, you can see an underline, you can see a lot of those different things. But, hold on, there we go. With chickens, it's different. Chickens, the males are prettier, right? Kind of like the human species. Not really, right, fellas? Not at all. So the males are much more ornate. They've got more of a comb. So you can see a bigger comb on these guys than you do on any of these hens. You see hackle feathers that are typically colored and a lot more pronounced. So we had a chicken at home a little while ago that my girls were afraid of. We called her double neck because her hackle feathers were twisted and she was just a real mean old gal. So double neck would come after you, but these hackle feathers extend up over their wings, so they become, or this cape becomes very ornate. Even on white chickens, you'll see larger hackle feathers on those birds. Then once you start getting over the saddle and back, you can see pronounced differences in saddle feathers, and then the appearance and presence of what are called sickle feathers. So those long feathers that come out of the tail on males are a part of their ornate display to attract women to their, to attract hens to their particular liking, right? Then we get further past that, you're going to have the appearance of spurs on the bottom of those, on the feet of those roosters, where hens don't have any spurs. All of these birds are going to carry some fluff or some really light, small feathers that are there. They're called fluff feathers, right there at the bottom end of their butts. Okay. Buns is the technical term for the rear end of the chicken. Not really. Okay. So all of these, like this comb on these, are sexually dimorphic things, are a part of secondary sex characteristics that occur in both poultry and in livestock. So what would be some secondary sex characteristics that you would see in beef cattle, for example? In bulls? Not necessarily, because horns would be there from the time they're born and they just continue to get bigger. What I'm talking about, characteristics that appear after puberty.
Muscle.
Not necessarily. Muscle just gets bigger, right?
They're much more broad, like in general, like their face too. I don't know.
Okay. You're getting closer to the area that I'm talking about. What's that? The hump on their neck. Or what do we call that? It's called a crest, right? They'll have a more pronounced crest on the back of their neck. What about rams? What about sheep? What do we see with them? Their face gets wider on sheep. Their face starts getting, the ram's nostrils are getting bigger. Why is that important?
Intimidation.
Zero to do with intimidation. More to do with detecting when somebody is going to be receptive of mating, right? So rams have these sensors in their nose that can detect pheromones and hormone presence in those ewes. So you'll start seeing those secondary sex characteristics. Enlargement of gonads, right? So testicles are going to get larger after puberty, those type of things. So we see a lot of secondary sex characteristics. We can also see that secondary sex characteristics between male and female chickens, and it's referred to as sexual dimorphism. So it is much more evident in chickens than it is in other livestock species, just as a part of their basic biology. So the other thing, I'm just going to fast forward over some of the feather stuff. We're going to talk about feathers a little bit more, particularly when we look at flight feathers and looking at how many feathers are on the bottom side of their wing. But what I want to get into is some of this internal anatomy. So you're going to have two things that you're going to look at today. Digestive anatomy, and their whole GI tract from end to end, And then the other part is the reproductive tract. So starting with the digestive tract, and kind of moving through that, we're going to skip over the respiratory tract. Just real quick, their lungs in chickens are very underdeveloped. So when you open up that bird, you see their lungs are going to be stuck up to their rib cage. They really don't have lung tissue that greatly expands and contracts. What do they use instead? They use these air sacs. They're located all throughout their body, right? That also helps with a little bit of flight and lift and those type of things, and making those chickens a little bit less dense. So they don't have that big, huge lung tissue that's there going to expand and contract. It's these open sacs that are there, and there are all sorts of different air sacs as you move through that bird. But if we move over and start looking at our digestive system, right? The digestive system in a chicken is far different than what we see in most of our livestock species because they are monogastrics. Pigs are monogastrics too, right? Cattle are ruminants or monogastrics? Ruminants, very good. So, what goes into a rumen and what comes out of a rumen are two different things. It's not one-to-one. If I put some feed stuff in, I should get some breakdown of it and get X coming out of it. Instead of X coming out of the end of that rumen, what I get is 45. Right? Something that's really weird. So the rumen is this little black box where what goes into it and what come out of it are two different things. And that is because of microbial fermentation and microbial digestion that occurs in the rumen. Because some of what comes out is actually the microbes as nutrients. And the way they are going to break things down into different products that weren't there before. So that changes everything. But chickens and pigs, nutrition is awesome. Because what goes in and how it gets metabolized and spread out through their body and utilized, I can identify every source of where that nutrient's being metabolized, what are waste products, what are actually used. That's why chicken people get excited about we increased average daily gain by 1/100th of a gram. Right? 1/100th of a gram. Think about that. What is that? It's not, it's nothing, right? Multiplied by 100,000 birds. Starts to become something, right? 1/10 of a gram. They get crazy about 1/10 of a gram. You get average daily gain differences of 1/10 of a gram. That changes how birds are raised. So we understand nutrition really well in monogastrics and in monogastric animals because we can partition all of those nutrients as they're being metabolized through their system. So it's important to understand the physiology of the gastrointestinal tract and kind of go through this from end to end. So if we start in right here at their beak and their mouth, do they have teeth? Now, right? Chickens don't have teeth. Everybody clear on that, right? My kids think they have teeth. They don't have teeth. They have a sharp beak, right, that they can get confused with a tooth. Does a chicken at any point in its life have a tooth? When?
When it's an egg, that's all I have to know.
And what's that called? The egg tooth. That's right. So it's just a little hardened spot at the end of its soft beak that they use to penetrate out of the egg. Okay. So food's going in there. Whatever they're eating is going into their mouth, and it's not going to have any mechanical digestion, right? What do we start with when we consume food? The first thing we do is mechanical digestion, and that's the grinding and getting all that stuff out. Then it's going to go through the esophagus. So when we open up these birds to start with, the first thing we're going to do is open up from their breastbone or from their wishbone up to their throat. And we're going to expose the esophagus, and we're going to expose the trachea. So you guys can understand the difference between those two tubes that run parallel with each other. Right? Okay? So we're going to do that, then everything goes into the crop. All right, so what is the point of the function of the crop? Right? As feed travels down the esophagus, you want to think about the feed that's going into these birds. Would you call it wet feed or dry feed?
Dry.
It's awfully dry, right? So the crop allows for moistening that food and softening some of that food before it goes into their two-part stomach. So chickens really have kind of a two-part stomach, which includes the proventriculus and the gizzard. So the proventriculus is going to secrete all sorts of things like hydrochloric acid, digestive enzymes, and mucus to start breaking that food down. Now, if that food's been softened up a little bit by hanging out in the crop for a little while, so sometimes my kids forget to fill the feed trough right at home, and then you'll fill the feed trough up. The chickens will go over there and hammer down on all that feed. Then they'll say, Daddy, they look weird. They're all hanging out like they have this big lump on one side of their body. I said, yeah, that's all the feed that they just ate that's sitting in their crop. What's a crop, right? So we have to do this at home, too. So hydrochloric acid then activates the digestive enzymes, and it can start working on that softened feed. But they still have large chunks of that feed that's coming into them. So then you get down to this next part of their stomach, which is called the gizzard, or the ventriculus. So if it's it's prior to the ventriculus, so you get the ventriculus or the gizzard. Once you guys understand the gizzard is like a clamshell, right? It is solid muscle. It's like holding a big heart, like a beef heart, in your hand. That gizzard is going to take all that feed coming out of the proventriculus, and that muscle is going to do this. And it's just going to grind it up. It's going to keep grinding all that stuff up like this, and then that feed is going to go back and forth between the proventriculus and the gizzard, right, as it's being ground up. Think of it like mastication and regurgitation and deglutition or swallowing in ruminant livestock, right? They go up, they chew it up, they swallow it, microbial stuff happens on it, comes back up again. All we're doing here is we're just moving back and forth between the gizzard and the proventriculus to get proper digestion of those feeds. Inside, and this is what we'll do today too, is when you take that gizzard and you do a lateral incision around the outside of it and open up and cut that gizzard in half, there's this thick, yellow, leathery layer inside the gizzard that is a wonderful little material that the animal makes themselves to prevent the tissue from getting damaged from all the muscular grinding that's occurring in there. That's why sometimes chickens in house facilities or even at home, if they're not out on dirt, you'll see chickens pecking up the ground, picking up rocks. We used to feed chickens oyster shells to add to that grit that is in. So there's a lot of grit that's in the gizzard as you're moving through there. All right. So then as it leaves the gizzard, as soon as we get on the south end side of the gizzard, we're heading into the small intestine, right? The small intestine, if you took a cross-section of that and looked at it underneath the microscope, it'll look like fingers that are coming from the outside wall to the inside. And those fingers get smaller as they approach the end of the lumen of the small intestine. So you have microvilli that are each finger-like projections and in each villus. So you'll have if that's your small intestine, you'll have these villi like this that are in there. And then when you zoom in on that, so if we took this section right here and zoom in on it, you're going to see all of these little projections that stick off of there. Those are the microvilli. That is where all of that food is being absorbed. Now, if those animals get sick, if they're not adjusting food, the depth of the crypt, or this area right here, is what they call the crypt. And the depth of those crypts will be shallow. And the more shallow they are, the less surface area there is for digestion. Does that make sense? So you'll get to see some of that stuff. If you cut it from a side profile, you'll see a little bit of folding inside the small intestine, but you'll really be able to see it from a microscopic view. So nutrients are then absorbed in the small intestine and transported to the liver. So let's go back up here. Here's our small intestine. Starting right here, we get this duodenal loop. Okay, so there's three parts to the small intestine. The duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Remember that order. That'll be on a quiz. That'll be on an exam, right? It's duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Don't jump in, right? Duodenum, jejunum, ileum, don't jump in. So you have this pancreatic loop right here coming up. You can see these pancreatic ducts and everything going to the liver coming off of the small intestine. So the pancreas is going to provide digestive enzymes. We've talked about this before. The gallbladder and bile duct are going to provide digestive enzymes to break all of this stuff down to be able to absorb those nutrients. So they're going to secrete their own fluids through the duodenum and the common duct. It's going to break down a lot of this stuff into digestible foods. The liver on a chicken is very different than ours. It only has 2 lobes where we have a 4-lobe liver. And I want you guys to see those differences as you're walking through here. Now, just a little point to notice that when you're doing your dissections and you're moving that liver around, right on the bottom side of that liver is the gallbladder. You get that gall fluid over anything, it's going to turn everything green. So be real careful when you're dissecting that out so you don't pierce, nick, cut, completely eradicate the gallbladder as you're butchering those birds. Well, as we are dissecting those birds. All right, so we move through the small intestine, right? So this is also small intestine until you get to the ileocecal junction, and then you have your 2 ceca. So chickens do have a form of hindgut fermenting, right? And that's where the ceca is. But remember, on the ceca on a chicken is a blind pouch. The ceca doesn't go anywhere. So it goes off, you got the ileocecal junction, that food's going to go off into either cecum and go in and then come back out. And then any of the waste products are going out through their large intestine, out their cloaca and vent. Where's the bladder? Do chickens have a bladder? No, they don't. Very good. Okay. So everything, chickens have a single port, right? They have a cloaca and a vent, which is also connected to the reproductive system, especially on the female side of this. All right, so on your notes, the internal organs of the digestive system that you should identify: esophagus, crop, proventriculus, the gizzard, duodenum, pancreas, jejunum. We're going to talk about some of these little things like this, like Meckel's diverticulum. Because these are older birds, Meckel's diverticulum is very hard to observe. But basically, it's the remnants of their umbilical cord, their analogous umbilical cord to the yolk sac. So on younger birds, on broilers, when you kill broilers, you can see a little, just like a little remnant of a yolk sac that's still attached to that site. So it'll be in the ileum or the distal part of the small intestine. Right, so make sure that you kind of get this paired ceca, that you see all that stuff, and get everything together there. All right. Other organs that you should identify are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Heart, kidney, spleen, we'll take a look at all that stuff too, right? All right. Questions? Stop the video. Okay, so the next section then is reproductive physiology of the birds. So again, we talked about sexual dimorphism before. Now we're going to look at that in terms of sexual organs that are involved in both the male and female. So every time, and this is an important thing to think about, every time a chicken lays a fertilized egg, do those chickens have to copulate to lay a fertilized egg? People are shaking their head no. Why?
To lay a fertilized egg?
To lay a fertilized egg.
Yeah.
You have to copulate every time. Everything else works that way, right? For the most part, in animal agriculture, Everything else does. What's different about chickens?
The chickens store it.
Yeah, hens are hoarders, right? So they copulate once. Have you ever seen copulation in chickens? It's a little violent, right? So you wouldn't want that to happen every time a gal's got to lay a fertilized egg. Remember, she's going to do that on a daily basis, right? If you got a rooster in there, she's laying an egg every day.
How often can she hold it?
It's a good question. We'll come to that in just a minute.
Okay.
But that stored semen that's there in those females allows for those girls to kind of hang on to that and not have to copulate for every fertilized egg. Do they have to copulate to be able to have semen stored in them? Yes, right? But they don't have to do that for every single fertilized egg, to have a different copulation event. Okay, so that's an important thing to realize, that there's a difference there. Okay, so the other thing is that the female reproductive system is so different than mammalian reproductive systems. They have this big cluster of ovum, right? Where it may include up to 4,000 small ova, which develop into yolks. And that's where it starts, and then the egg kind of forms after that. So each yolk, or each one of those small ovum, are attached to this egg sac, or this yolk sac that is that's present inside these birds. Okay? And then we're going to talk about the different parts of the reproductive tract. So with female reproductive anatomy, right? You have the ovary, and this is what that cluster of yolk sacs look at. So you have this female reproductive anatomy where you've got this yolk sac where you've got different stages of yolk sacs or follicles at this point. So the follicles that you see as a part of this yolk sac can be broken up into 3 different stages. You've got pre-hierarchical follicles, which are small, white, yellow follicles. Then you've got pre-ovulatory follicles, and these are the ones that you'll see most abundantly because they're big, they're going to be in your face, they're just large. If you are not careful when you're removing this part, it will just turn into a runny egg, right? You guys kind of get, it's like you pop the sunny side up egg and it just yolk everywhere. Be careful when you're dissecting this part out so you can get that whole yolk sac out. So there are different stages of pre-ovulatory follicles, and then what's left is the post-ovulatory follicle, which is an empty sac, right? Okay, so let's look at the oviduct on a chicken. All right. So there's our reproductive tract. There's our ovary, which has all of those yolks together. Then there's this large kind of horn-shaped opening, which is just this large kind of clear white tissue called the infundibulum. The infundibulum will catch the mature ovum, which is the yolk sac, right? The great thing that you'll see about these F5 or these late-stage pre-ovulatory follicles is that there'll be what's called a suture line or a stigma. And that stigma will separate, and you'll see all this vascularization that occurs right around that suture line. So that's something that happens as a natural part there. Then we go down into the infundibulum and into the different parts of the female reproductive tract. So after the infundibulum is the magnum. Okay? And the magnum is divided by the isthmus by a narrow, by all these little glands. The isthmus is a little bit smaller. So if we go back up just a smidge here. Okay. So let's go here. Our yolk is engulfed by the infundibulum. Fertilization of the ovum follows immediately. So once that ovum gets into the infundibulum, then those sperm cells will fertilize the egg. They're stored in glands or nests located in the infundibulum and are released as the yolk passes. So I think if memory serves me, it's a week to 2 weeks for semen storage. Good? That was your answer to your question? Okay? And then once that yolk sac passes through the infundibulum, whether or not it got fertilized, it's going to then enter the magnum of the oviduct, where the dense portion of the albumin is added. So for each step and each section of the reproductive tract in the chicken, it's going to be different parts of the egg are added on. And eggs are built from the inside out. Yes, ma'am?
So if it can store it for up to 2 weeks, is every single egg in that 2-week period going to be fertilized?
Maybe, maybe not.
Okay.
But there's good likelihood, right?
Yeah.
So it just depends. Probably, let's say that an estimate of 70 to 80% will be, right? But most people don't, I mean, we don't have any roosters at home. Everybody sexes chicks now, so you can really control that. And most commercial operations don't use natural matings, they use artificial insemination. So,
Isn't that really expensive in...
what's that?
Isn't that really expensive in chickens?
Artificial insemination? No,
Why?
no, because they store semen, right? So you can inseminate a bird, and then she's going to lay eggs
It's
for,
expensive to like castrate, right?
to
Chickens?
castrate a chicken.
Not castrate, but like,
To collect a rooster? What are you talking about?
there's something is expensive with chickens, and they don't do it a lot because it's expensive. I don't
Okay.
know.
Well, so chickens, they do some natural mating with chickens, but most stuff, and well, particularly with turkeys, they do a lot of AI in turkeys, right? Turkeys almost exclusively AI because the males can't walk very well for a very long time. So with chickens, they do more natural service, more natural matings on those birds, but they will also do artificial insemination. And if you ever want to see that done, Dr. Taylor does that with his birds at the livestock farm. So he will go out there, he'll collect a rooster, and then he has this little apparatus that he uses to inseminate females. So that's kind of fun. All right, good question. Anything else? Okay, so we're talking about the magnum, and we're talking about the thick albumin that is going to be laid down around that yolk. So that's where that side is going to happen. So that albumin serves as shock-absorbing substance, feeds the developing embryo, and then the shape of the egg is largely determined in this magnum. So the thick albumin, that's that thick portion of the egg white that's around the yolk, right? When you start thinking about how all this stuff comes together. The magnum is divided from the isthmus by a narrow translucent ring without glands. The isthmus is smaller in diameter than the magnum, which helps shape that egg a little bit. And then this is where we start getting two shell membranes that are formed. The shell membranes loosely contain the yolk and dense white until the rest of the albumin is added to the uterus. Now, have you ever opened an egg and then there's that lining on the inside? So I was a little kid, and this is what people used to do back in the day. I was running backwards, and I turned around, and we had this old Ford truck that was in our hay barn. And I smacked my head right at the end, and on the side rails, it was a step-side truck, and the side rails had that little curve on it. I've got a little half-moon cut on the side of my head. So my dad, instead of taking me to the hospital, which most parents would do and get stitches, brought me inside, stopped the bleeding, and then he peeled off the inside of an eggshell and used that as kind of like suture tape. Right? So he kept saying, replace it every now and then, crack another egg, put it on there, you'll be fine. So a lot of people used to use that for suturing before there were needle and thread and all that kind of stuff around. But that's what that membrane is. It's really sticky and adherent membrane as we go through that egg. Then we get down to the uterus or the shell gland. So remember that we're getting a really tough kind of two membrane layer around the white and the yolk. Then in the shell, we're going to start adding more shell, or in the shell gland is going to add more components. So the place where the egg stays the longest in any of these sites is in the uterus. So it's there for about 20 hours. And that's where it's going to sit, and that's where that shell is laid on, is in the uterus. So then if the hen lays brown eggs, the brown pigments are added to the shell in the last hours of formation. If they lay white eggs, there's no other dye or color that's added to those eggs. Then, right around here is where you start seeing the chalaza. Those are those two cords that hold the yolk into place, and they keep the yolk centered in the eggs, and they appear in the uterus. They also function as an axis around which the yolk can rotate and keep the germinal disc at the top side of that egg at all times, right? Because that's where all the growth is going to occur on that part. The last part of the oviduct is the vagina, It puts a thin coating on the egg that allows that egg to be to leave the reproductive tract, and it helps apply a little bit of coating to the shell. Shells are porous, so it's a great opportunity for stuff from the outside environment to get into the egg. Some of this bloom that's applied in the vagina is applied to the outside of that egg that prevents a lot of stuff getting into the egg after that. Let's see. So we're going to do this female reproductive tract. So we've gone through from stem to stern on those ones. So the infundibulum, this is where fertilization is going to occur. The magnum, that's where you've got your white that's laid down, or the thick white that's laid down around the egg. The isthmus is going to add that outer layer, right? Those two outer membranes. The uterus is where the shell is going to be formed. And then that's going to come out the vagina where it is coated in that bloom to make sure the eggs are protected in the environment, and the egg will exit through the cloacal vent. All right. Now, that's the female side of everything. The male side, what's the biggest difference between roosters and a ram? Yeah.
Testicles are on its back.
Not like on its back, like it carries them around like a backpack, right?
It straddles the spine.
They're internal, right? So the testes are internalized. So what do we usually talk about, you know, when we're doing this and talking about beef cattle, we're talking about how the scrotum is going to be a thermal regulator. Chicken sperm doesn't have to do that. It doesn't have to be thermal regulated. It likes a hot environment like that. And it actually stays around a lot longer than sperm that comes out of these guys. It's much more, it's not as sensitive as sperm coming out from these other livestock species. The other thing is that the testes represent or constitute about 1% of the total body weight of that chicken. All right. Let's put this into context. I'm walking around at about 240 pounds. 1% of my body weight is what? 2.4 pounds. If I was a chicken, I would have 2.4 pounds of testicles, right? Now the repro stuff can get gross really fast, right? But, so think about it as think about things that weigh 2 pounds, right? That's what, yeah, right? So one of the things that you guys are going to look at today is actually extract the testicles from those males, weigh them before, weigh them after, weigh the testes, and kind of take a look at that as well. So there's a lot of difference in the reproductive tracts when we start doing that. And I point this out because it's such a physiological phenomenon that is so great. Those birds have enormous testicles for their total body size, which is not as common in other species. So their testes are right next to the kidneys. The vas runs right down next to the kidneys as you're moving down their spine. And then they've got ureters. Everything comes out through a cloaca and the fold opening that unfolds and allows them to the female. So this is how they actually sex birds, is through vent sexing. And you can get trained how to do that and work for some different bird operations doing that. All right, questions? What you can do is just pull out all those feathers going up. Now, one of the things I want you to look at are their flight feathers, right? So these are all the feathers that are on the bottom side of their wing. Everybody see that? Okay, so let's count these feathers up as we go out here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Everyone will be like that, and then there's going to be one little feather right there. It's called the axial feather. Everybody see that? And then you'll have your other feathers here. So then you did axial feather 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So 10, axial feather 14. It'll be like that on every bird. They're all made the same. Okay? So if you don't want a bird to be able to fly, you take all of these off. Right? You just cut them off and then they can't generate any left. The other thing, when you have these birds like this, I want you to look at the difference in feather types from these primary feathers are out here to the secondary feathers that are inside their wing. So you'll notice that they still have a rib that's associated with it, but then you get to these fluff feathers where their rib is not as dominant, right? So just take a look at those quick differences between all of that. All you want to do is just pull those feathers out, well, and you can skin them while you're doing that too. So once you open up their skin like that, you can go ahead and take your knife, and if this chicken would lay properly, their neck doesn't lay really well, and I'll let you guys think about why that may be. Anybody have an idea why that may be?
The crop.
What's that?
The crop.
No.
It's just too tired.
It's too tight. Or they did cervical dislocations on the birds and cracked their neck, and that's why it doesn't lay right. Okay. So,
I like that he's a little tired.
you like that he's a little tired?
He's a little
Well, this
tired.
isn't a he, so we'll have to make sure we get all that part correct too. All right, so that you can see right there where that blood is.
Yay.
Okay, so that's where the neck was broken, where the birds were euthanized. When that happens, it happens immediate. It's immediate death. Right? There's no lingering around or anything else like that. There's no other outcome other than death that occurs at that point. Okay, so let's take a look at what we got going on here. The difference between the trachea and the esophagus can be observed right here. So the trachea is ribbed. It's a solid. You might have to zoom in on that a little bit. It is, let's see if I can do a little coarse dissection. I want you guys to feel that difference between them, right? The trachea, and then this right behind it is the esophagus. Okay. The esophagus is soft, pliable, right, open to allow larger foodstuffs to pass through there. The trachea has to be hard, right? Because if it wasn't propelled open, then there's no way that air could move through there. Surface tension on that wet tube would just keep everything tight as you're going through there, okay? All right, so the trachea is going to go dorsally. And everything's going to run behind the pericardium and then enter the stomach from the backside of this bird. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You guys might want to plug your ears over there.
Oh.
Okay. So then that way, those birds will just stay pretty soft for you and in the right position. This way you work up front?
She works at Chick-fil-A.
Oh, that's where it comes from. Awesome. Okay.
So I do research on my jokes before I drop them.
Wow. Man, I feel like in the loop now. All right. Okay, so what we're going to do is take this knife and cut upwards towards their keel bone. Right, so see how that's lifting up like that? Maybe you want to get me a pair of those scissors. Okay. Well, I'll pause. Are there scissors over there? So once you open up underneath their keel bone like that, I'm going to put this a little bit further. So you want to cut up towards the bone. Then you'll be able to feel the ribs on this side of it. So then all you need to do is just roll this up here like this, and then just stick this right on the ribs. Okay. Do the same thing on this side. These things do suck. And then you're just going to move that forward like that. Okay. See how you have everything that's nice. The chicken isn't murdered, isn't just torn apart, that you can dissect this bird out fairly well. Okay, so then what you can do is just dissect some of that skin back. Then you have this really thin tissue that's right there. and then their digestive tract. So what is this right here on top? I don't know. Is that an answer to a question? No.
Right here?
Yeah, right there.
Gizzard?
No, that's the lizard. That's the liver,
Liver.
right? You guys said when you answered it with the question, that's why I was being a little bit snotty, right? Okay. That's the liver. So it's right there in front of your face. Everything's good. Okay. So we're going to dissect this back around a little bit. Okay. So the gizzard is right there. That's that hard thing. Okay. What's that right there?
Can't see.
Right there at the top.
The heart?
Very good. That's the heart.
So tiny.
It's so tiny. It's not a very big bird. Okay, so all we're going to do is just use our fingers, right? We're not going to knife through this stuff. You can use your fingers to do what's called blunt dissection and just kind of dissect some of this fat away from your body. Come here, baby. Because right underneath there, you see those underneath? Mm-hmm. Those are all the egg yolks. Those are all the yolks that were right there. So I'm just going to take that up. I may have just cut something there. It's probably part of our egg tract. Yep. All right. What we can do. So I'm just using my fingers, doing a little blunt dissection. And that's a lot better than using a knife. And we're just kind of scooping this stuff out. So there's her heart. There. Okay. And then her lungs are these bright pink things up against her rib cage. So right in here, right there, those are her lungs. Okay. Oh, she's got a fully formed egg right here.
She has an egg up in here? Wow.
Oh, there it is.
All right.
Well, my aunt still eats those when she dissects chickens.
I was gonna say, would you still be able to like eat that?
If you wanted to, I'm sure.
I mean, I don't want it. I was just, no. I don't like eggs.
Did you not have breakfast this morning, Erin?
I don't like breakfast.
I don't have no breakfast either.
I don't eat eggs.
It's a perfectly good egg.
I don't eat eggs though, so I don't like eggs.
Okay.
I have chickens that don't eat eggs.
So you've always had them from the chicken. How about in the chicken?
So right there is the proventriculus, and I broke that off.
Maybe worth a try someday.
You only need one shot to do it.
I don't have anywhere to cook it.
Oh, I bet you we can find a place.
I'll come to your house and we can cook it together.
I will. I will do it right now.
And you can bring those hot plates back out from when we did sausage.
Yeah, and the polka music and the whole thing, right?
You can cook it in the microwave. It'll be fine.
That is esophagus. We'll put off of there. There's your crop. Okay, and then here's all the kind of mesenteric fat that's associated with the gut. And then, right here, so there's liver. This part right here is the proventriculus. Okay. There's the proventriculus, and there is the gizzard. So the gizzard has that kind of silver skin on the outside. It's a very dense muscular tissue.
It's very good to eat. I was gonna say something.
My mom used to put them in stews all the time. So when we were butchering chickens at home, I just cut off the small intestine. So that's the proventriculus. That's right there. That precedes the ventriculus. So when you're cutting these open, just be very careful not to cut into your hand. I would say don't do this at home, but my sister and I used to have competitions about who could peel the gizzard off in one piece, right? And I am a master at doing this. But I want you, I'm not doing this just to show off, I'm doing this because I want you guys to feel what that texture is like. You can see how hard and leathery that is. And then those ribs inside the gizzard. See that big, thick, muscular layer that does a lot of the push. So the edges, the lateral ends of the gizzard are really dense and thick, where the middle portion is not. So that allows for this grinding that can go on. And then it's ribbed on the inside, which is, it's like a washboard, right?
And that's the protective layer.
That
It
is
develops.
the lining of the gizzard, right? So you can feel that, right? Real leathery, thick. Okay. So from there, we go out into the small intestine. You can see these pancreatic and bile ducts that are going from the small intestine right here. You can see them all right, 1, 2, 3. They're all right there. And then you have this duodenal loop. And the duodenal loop houses the pancreas right inside there. So all those digestive enzymes and everything else are going into the small intestine from that duodenal loop and also going to the liver. A lot of that stuff from the small intestine is being shunted to the liver for their nutrient absorption. Okay. So then we got small intestine, and I am looking for Meckel's diverticulum. So we're just being really easy.
It's like a kidney bean.
That's not it. Let me jump on again. That's just doo-doo. That's doo-doo, baby. Okay. So here's our branched ceca. They're coming out this way. You'll see them really well here once I turn this over. And everything goes out the other end, right? Okay. Meckel's, where are you at? And like I said, it's hard to see in these older birds because they're 100 years old.
How old is this one, do you know?
Only 2 or 3 years old at least. So Dr. Taylor goes through a pot. Oh, there it is. That's it right there. See that little thing sticking up? That's what's left of the primordial egg sac, where it's kind of like their little nubbin right there on its small intestine. So that's what's left of their egg sac when she was a little baby. Speaking of egg sacs, let's move on to our second part of our digestive tract. So I just want you guys to go through and identify all of those parts, kind of get an idea of what it feels like to...
I hope that she'd bring it for this class. Remember that day you promised Chick-fil-A for class? This would have been,
I did not.
this
You
would have been the
promised
day.
it.
This
So
would have
where
been the
is
day.
it?
Yeah, I don't remember that conversation.
How about we all go to Chick-fil-A after?
Yeah.
I'm done.
Okay, so let's look at this yolk. So this one's really cool. You can see that suture line or the stigma, right? You see that on there? And that developing follicle or that developing ovum right there. And then what I need to do a little bit more blunt dissection. Get the rest of this stuff out.
I love how they always look so big and they're just like, oh, I'm like itty bitty.
Okay, air sacs, caudal air sacs in the back of the bird. Come on, baby. Oh, that's the vagina and everything else. I just ripped her out. Yep, I said that out loud.
On camera.
On camera. Yeah, right. Okay, so here is, that's the, what? The first part.
The cone.
Yeah, the cone. Starts with an N. It's kind of fun. Found in the debulum. Can you guys put all those together? The infundibulum.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So that's gonna go through there. Then the next part is what? The magnum, right? So there's the magnum, and then there's that narrow channel called the isthmus, right? And then, what's after the isthmus? The uterus or the shell gland, and then there's your egg. Now this one isn't fully formed yet. You can kind of, once you guys pass it around a little bit, if you hold it up to light, you can kind of see through it a little bit still. So the eggshells are still pretty light. But feel how slimy it is? That's that bloom that the vagina puts on the egg. Okay. All right, here's another example. Maybe we can zoom in on the suture line. Okay. And that's your job today, is just to go through the birds that are out here and take a look.